Good afternoon, and I hope that you had a great spring break. If you're watching this video, then you're currently registered to take the online COM 295 Communication Theory course with me, Dr. Benjamin Mann. Each week, I'll be uploading a video that goes over some of the major content from the readings and things to know related to the class, including updates and reminders. Watching the videos is not required for this course, but you can think of it as a supplement that helps to contextualize and use some of the things that are gone over in the readings and give you some additional insight that will help you as you work through the course. Thank you so much for registering for this class, and I'm excited to use this class as an opportunity to share some of the things related to communication theory that will help you out. Each week, I'll also be using slides. These slides will go over some of the major things to know, and those slides will also be uploaded so that you can access them on Canvas as well. So for this week, I would like to give a short introduction of myself and what I do, the syllabus and class expectations, and then we'll be talking about chapters 1 through 3 of your textbook that discuss some of the ways that we can analyze and use theory. So, for those of you that have not taken a class with me before, I'm an assistant professor of communication here at Eastern Oregon University. I grew up just outside of Portland in the Westland, Lake Oswego area. Thought I was going to be a high school English teacher, but I fell in love with competitive speech and debate and decided to do that as part of my career. I then moved to Stockton, California, where I completed a master's in communication, and then lived in Salt Lake City, Utah, where I completed a PhD in communication studies. And I'm delighted to be back in my home state and teaching a variety of different courses in communication. Communication theory is one of my favorites. Some of the things that I specialize and focus on are issues of rhetoric and critical cultural studies. I'm really interested in persuasion, some of the ways that we make messages that persuade and influence one another. I also am really active in understanding how people with disabilities use activism, including online spaces, to advocate for their needs. That's something I talk a lot about a little bit more this term in my Communicating Health and Science course. And I have a background, as mentioned, in competitive speech and debate. This is the University of Utah's speech and debate team, which recently won a national championship. And I love helping people develop public speaking and argumentation skills. In my spare time, I have a 3-year-old. She's 3 today. It's her 3rd birthday, Labrador Retriever named Sylvie. I also, on the side, like to do independent video game design, and I'm working on a prototype. So for this class, I want to dive into some of the nuts and bolts of understanding and making sense of theory. Pictured here is what's known as the ivory tower. You might have heard this phrase before. That's essentially used to describe academia, right? At its worst, academia and the development and building of theory is just all over here on this tower, right? And is separated from the world. It doesn't really feel useful or helpful or beneficial. And at its worst, theory goes that direction, right? If you're thinking about why we study theory or what the point is of studying theory, it's not to be this abstract, detached, not real world way of thinking about issues. Theory, instead of being this tower, are tools for living. My master's advisor used that phrase when I took my first communication class at Pacific and told me, theory are kind of like, your wrench, your pliers. They're the tools that help us to use communication in a lot of different situations. For instance, some of the theories that we'll be going over in this course relate to face-to-face communication and how we can improve our communication with other people so that we can understand each other. Or maybe we're working in a group on a project or a work assignment and want to make that communication go well. Maybe we're involved in public relations and we're doing a broader campaign to reach a wide audience. Communication is a great skill to have, and theory helps us to understand that too. Or doing public speaking for a large audience. Theory essentially provide us with ways of looking at and viewing the world like a pair of glasses that can help us to understand and make sense of a lot of different experiences. Some of the ways that theory helps us can include with employment and plans, helping us if we're working in a group, figuring out PR, or a lot of different areas that communication becomes involved in. Critical thinking, right? Critical thinking is trying to understand what's going on here. right? It's not taking a message at face value, but instead critically thinking about and assessing what that message means, if that message is true or false, and how that message could impact our lives. Knowing and understanding research is a crucial component of this too. Theory are developed by doing research, right? By people being involved in the field and trying to understand what's going on. Theory also let us make sense of our own experiences. For instance, some of the interpersonal communication theories like uncertainty reduction theory are about understanding the ways that we can relate to and communicate with one another and make sense of our experience. It can help us become more aware of our lives and also can be useful in knowledge for knowledge's sake, the idea that we are interested in learning and growing as people. So those are all things that I think communication can really help us to develop in terms of our own skills and goals. What I want to direct you to next is to the syllabus as well as the course expectations to help you with catching up in the course. If you click here on the front page of Canvas, you'll notice that the course syllabus is listed right here. You can click this anytime if you need to catch up related to the course. That is for my face-to-face course. So let me go ahead and pull up the online version. So if you go here to the front page, you can access the course syllabus. You'll notice that my email is listed right here. So it's easy for you if you need to get in touch with me to email me. I do have an office phone, so you can call the office number if you need to. What I do for my office hours is Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 11 a.m. to 12:45 p.m. I have a Zoom room that's listed on the front page of Canvas open, and you're welcome to drop into that room at any time. You can also schedule a meeting with me if you want to talk about your grade or workshop or work through an assignment. So I'll have that available through Zoom as well. You'll also notice that there is this Weston Turner Introducing Communication Theory Analysis and Application reading that's required. I posted the PDFs of the first week's readings so that you don't need the textbook for the first week, but I highly recommend that you either purchase or rent or get the ebooks so that you can have that all ready for the second week of the course. I posted some links in a previous Canvas announcement about accessing the readings. And I highly recommend that you rent the ebook. It's about $32, $33, and you get it right away. I think that's the cheapest and most efficient way to do that. But you can also rent or purchase a used copy. You can use an older edition, that's just fine. But I don't want you to be paying more than $30 or $40 to it. I like to use free open access whenever possible, but there's no good equivalent for this course. So I unfortunately did need to assign a textbook, but I'd like it to be affordable for you. I respond to emails pretty quickly. Feel free to reach out at any point if you need it. This is an online asynchronous course that doesn't require any sort of Zoom meetings or anything like that. We no longer require masks on campus, but if you have any other courses on campus, you're recommended to check out the COVID-19 guidelines. Some of the basic information here about accommodations and so on are listed here. I'm not going to go over those in more detail, but if you have questions about these policies, please let me know. So you're welcome to join that office Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 11 a.m. to 12:45. If you're falling behind in the course, the best thing you can do is to reach out to me in advance. Think about it kind of like if you have a fire, right? If there's a fire in your house, you call the fire department or you get an extinguisher and burn it down as soon as and take it out as soon as possible so that you don't burn down the house. You don't wait until the house is burned all the way down and say, help, there was a fire. The sooner you reach out to me, if you're falling behind or you need support in the course, the better, and the more I'm able to reach back out and help you. Please submit your assignments to Canvas as PDF, doc, or docx. For late assignments, it's -5% for each day the assignment is late. However, if you know that you're falling behind or you're at a really busy point in the course and you need an extension, contact me as soon as possible, preferably like a week in advance. Let me know a little bit about your situation and let me know what would be a reasonable extension for you. That way, I can help you to make that extension be met and give you what you need in order to do well in the course. Grading is fairly standard for this course as well. The grading breakdown is there, and I'll have rubrics available for you for your major assignments. Please cite your sources. I recommend APA, but you can use MLA or Chicago. And I do look at rough drafts or outlines in advance too. Each week, I offer a quiz. You'll notice that the link to the quiz is available on Canvas for this week. The quiz is open note, open book, and just covers content from that week's reading. So you're welcome to complete the quiz once you finish the readings, but those are due on Sundays. Also due on Sundays of most weeks are activities. This week's activity is also posted and is asking you to start to think about and engage with communication theory. So please read those prompts, answer them fully to receive credit. During the third week, I'm asking you to do an annotated bibliography where you look at one of the theories and look at some additional sources and discussion related to that theory with some annotations and points related to that. You have a couple application papers in the course. Each of the application papers is essentially asking you to go over some of the key ideas of the theory and then apply that theory to a piece of communication. It could be a speech, it could be an advertisement, it could be a TV show episode or movie, any piece of communication that you feel like is a good fit and is interesting to you is a good candidate for your application paper. And we'll be looking at examples throughout the term of ways to apply and use some of these theories. There's a final research paper where you'll take one of your two application papers from the course, expand it out, add some more details and sources, and then you'll turn that in at the end of the term. And then I'll also offer an extra credit, which will add 20 points or 2% on to your final grade. I recommend for this week that you give the syllabus another look on your own, since there are some questions on this week's quiz that go over the syllabus. So please do that to help to catch up for the course. If you check out the schedule here, this is the link to access my Zoom office. You'll also see for this first week that the PDF for the readings are available. And you can click here to access week 1 quiz and week 1 activity that are due by Sunday. Again, this is pretty straightforward. Your assignments are due on Sundays by midnight. So that continues as we get into the next weeks of the course. I'll be populating as we continue to go through the course, the weeks and activities, for that particular week. And we'll just continue to go through various theories, concepts, and ideas in communication. With the final assignment due date on June 11th. So that goes over the core things to know about the course and about the course expectations. But if you have any other questions about the course and the way that it's structured, please let me know. So in this class, we'll be developing and applying theory to make sense and engage with the world. Again, dealing with the idea that theory are tools for living. They're not things in this ivory tower, they're things that we use and we can use every single day. I think a really good place to start, though, is to define what communication is and why communication matters to us. Communication is essentially how we use symbols to engage with one another. Words are symbols, right? They're a collection of these squiggly lines and curves that, when put together, represent an object. If we see the letters DOG, right, for dog, that doesn't actually visually represent a dog. However, what we know through language and socialization is that that sequence of letters, the ways that they are, represent or stand in for a dog. So communication is social, right? It involves how we try to make sense of meeting with other people. It involves at least two people, although there are some situations in which intrapersonal communication or communication with yourself is being used, and communication never ends. One of my favorite quotations is the idea that you can never not communicate. That if you're walking down a hall, right, you have clothing, you have facial expressions and verbal communication that you're doing as well. We're always using communication to interact with and engage with other people, whether we want to or not. The bumper stickers on your car, right, might be an example of how we communicate too. So symbols can be both concrete, which represent objects, and abstract, which represent ideas. One good way of thinking about this is a concrete symbol would be a domino, right? For Domino's Pizza. That's a very specific symbol that represents what it is. Or a picture of a dog, right? Could be a concrete symbol. But an abstract symbol could be like a letter, right? Or, for instance, pi, used in mathematics is another example. Pi, of course, is an incredibly long number, 3.14159, et cetera, et cetera. It goes and goes. People do contests over how long they can memorize pi, but it stands in for a complex idea. And in that case would be an abstract symbol. So we use a combination of both concrete and abstract symbols like words to communicate. Additionally, meaning and environment shape the communication process too. Meaning is what we get out of or extract out of the message. Environment is the situation or context in which we communicate. And that the models or ways of thinking about communication can simplify these relationships that we have. For example, one theory is this idea of the rhetorical situation. Following shortly after Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination, Robert F. Kennedy, who was a candidate for president at the time and was a clear frontrunner at the time, gave a speech in which he addressed MLK's death in downtown and gave a speech where he was responding to and addressing that situation. It's an example of how communication theory can model or explain what's happening in that situation. So in that situation, for instance, there was an exigence, an imperfection marked by urgency. In this situation, MLK had just died, and RFK was seen as a major player and person who was called to speak and address that issue. RFK was speaking downtown, but he also had a much larger audience to speak to as well. The whole world was watching, right? And it was an election year, so it was a significant time to address and speak to that issue. And then lastly, there were constraints in Robert F. Kennedy's speech. For instance, his own speaking style and elements outside of his control, like the very short amount of time that he had to prepare, right? So that's an example, looking at somebody giving a speech and using theory, in this case, the theory of the rhetorical situation, to make sense of, analyze, and understand what was happening there. That's what theory can do for us. Additionally, as discussed in the first chapter of your book, there are what are considered three major models of communication, which are linear, interactive, and transactional. The linear model is pretty straightforward. It suggests that there's a sender, the person that's giving the message, there's the message itself, right? And then there's the receiver who's taking in the message. For example, we could use the linear model to describe this video. I'm sending you a message, a video discussing content in the course. You as a student are receiving and taking in that video. And there's also noise. For instance, we've had some thunder and rain just a minute ago that's interfered with and impacted the video. So that linear model suggests this very straightforward way of communicating. We might use the linear model in like a public address or lecture of media or video. But the linear model doesn't necessarily think about how our communication is interactive. It's not always a one-way form. For instance, the interactive model of communication suggests that we're kind of going between sender and receiver. We're sending a message, somebody's taking a message, and we're responding back. If you're having a conversation with a friend or family member, you're telling them about your day and they're nodding or changing the subject or interrupting you or saying, aha, or interesting, and you're responding to that. Maybe you talk about a thing in your day that you didn't think was very interesting, but they're really fascinated by it. And that gets talked about a little bit more. So the interactive model can help us to understand and engage with that. The interactive model is kind of like a seesaw, right? We go back and forth between sender and receiver as we're trying to make sense of a message. Something like a public debate could be an example of that too. It's still, though, not super dynamic. So lastly, we have what we consider to be the transactional model. And the transactional model says that we are both senders and receivers at the same time, that we're giving feedback and responding to one another, and we're not alternating between sender and receiver. We're both, and we're using both of those to make sense of messages. We use the transactional model in casual conversation. People give each other verbal and nonverbal feedback all the time if you're talking to a friend or family member. If you're texting and using active forms of media, the little ... bubbles as you're texting somebody are an example of how feedback plays into the equation. And also public debates in which people are responding to and addressing each other's messages and at times getting very heated and talking over each other are examples of that model at play too. So this evolution of models helps us to understand what communication is and how communication works. And there's also issues of ethics, right? Ethics being this idea of what's right and wrong. Well, is there a right or wrong way to communicate? And as we see, ethics has so much application to a variety of areas, including business, religion, politics, technology, and so on. So we have to think about not only what it means to communicate, but also to communicate ethically. We're not going to yell fire in a crowded building. So shifting gears to the second chapter and some of the key points to know here, there's a discussion of different traditions in communication, and I'm going to give a short overview of each. First, we have the rhetorical tradition, which goes back to Aristotle. If you've taken a course in writing and rhetoric, you might know this one well, and it suggests some of the ways that we can persuade and influence one another, going back to Aristotle's rhetoric. Or if you've seen an ad, for instance, for gum that says 4 out of 5 dentists surveyed would recommend it. Rhetorical study would be looking at the persuasiveness of that message. Who are these dentists? How are they chosen? What's going on with the 5th dentist? How was the study conducted, right? Rhetorical study would critically analyze this message and its attempts to persuade you to get gum. Semiotic comes from Roland Barthes and comes from the idea of using signs. How do signs convey meaning? For example, in the United States, we typically have this pedestrian sign to indicate that people are crossing the street. And then here on the right, we have an example of, in Germany, the Ampelmann, which is a mascot who has his own store, but that's used as the traffic light walking sign in Germany. So semiotics would be concerned with how those signs or symbols are being used to convey meaning and convey social reality. Next is this idea of a phenomenological approach. How do we make sense out of our lives? How do we use our experiences and phenomena that we have in order to make things make sense to us? One example of this is the Johari window. There are things we know about ourselves and about that other people know about us. For instance, things like our physical appearance or interests. Things that other people know, but we don't know. For instance, if you have spinach in your teeth and you're walking around and don't know it, that could be an example there. Things that you know but other people don't could be things related to, for instance, gender or sexuality that you might not choose to disclose or discuss in every instance. And then unknown unknowns. But the phenomenological approach suggests that we have this kind of network of things we know or don't about ourselves that can impact our communication. Cybernetic is kind of a misnomer. It sounds very cyber tech oriented, but it's actually about how we engage in unpredictability and noise in communication. For instance, in the country of Bulgaria, somebody actually shakes their head to say yes and nods to say no. And if that was communicated in the United States, there might be a lot of confusion. Somebody's shaking their head, but it actually means yes. So the cybernetic approach would deal with that unpredictability, that noise, and things that get lost in translation. Socio-psychological, including including cultivation theory that we'll be talking about in the class, is looking at cause-effect relationships. Cultivation theory suggests that we are more likely to believe as true media that we're exposed to. So for instance, we might have a skewed perspective of how law enforcement works if we watched a lot of crime procedurals on TV, shows like NCIS or Criminal Minds. But it's looking at the relationship. We watch this and therefore we feel this way about how crime works. Sociocultural is about how we create reality together. For instance, something like a tennis team could create its own culture and identity. For instance, its interests, activities, jargon, and ways people communicate with one another. There's a lot of specialized terminology, for instance, the way things are scored, like 40 love, that might be specific to that group and its culture. And then lastly, critical. I come from a background in critical and cultural studies. I do work, for instance, looking at how power relates to communication. There was a hashtag campaign called Crypt the Vote that was designed to raise awareness about inaccessibility of voting in the United States, looking at power and the ways that maybe access to voting was not equally distributed. So critical is very much concerned with power. We see the word critical used a lot, right, and used kind of as a buzzword, but when we actually break down what critical means, it's really looking at power and the way power shapes our relationships. In addition, there are also contexts, otherwise known as subfields of communication, that I want to get into as well, and I'll be asking you to look at a little bit more for this activity. One of them is intrapersonal, that is talking or engaging with yourself. If you're like me and you do silly tongue twisters on the drive to work to get yourself ready and pumped up for the day, that's an example of interpersonal communication. Secondarily is the idea of interpersonal communication. It's communication primarily between two people that can happen face-to-face, online, etc. Small group typically involves 3 or more people. Generally, it's in the 3 to 12 range or so, but it's a smaller collection of people that you work with. Organizational communication is much larger. It's about how an organization, such as a company, nonprofit, or group, communicates and engages in things like hierarchy and relationships, like a supervisor to an employee. Public and rhetorical communication is about how speeches and larger forms of communication reach an audience and how we can use public speaking. For instance, we saw several examples of this yesterday at the Oscars. And of course, a lot of attention to the physical altercation between Will Smith and Chris Rock, right? That's an example of public rhetorical communication. He was very publicly trying to retaliate and respond to a joke against his wife. So regardless of where you stand on your opinion on that topic, it's an example of public and rhetorical communication. And then lastly, mass media, right? The way that we use things like Zoom, jokingly referred to in COVID as Zoom University, right? Twitter and other forms of media to communicate and share ideas. Cultural is really interesting as well, how we communicate across different cultures and backgrounds. For example, the Piraha indigenous people of the Amazon rainforest are what's known as anumeric. That is, they have a number to describe 1, 2, and 3, but beyond that, they say there's 1 stick, there's 2 sticks, there's 3 sticks. Beyond that, there are many sticks. They don't actually have words to describe numbers past 3 and are known, therefore, as anumeric. And one really interesting observation is they were asked to distinguish, for instance, 5 sticks versus 6 sticks, and didn't notice the difference between the two. So there's really interesting ways in how communication shapes our reality and understanding of the world. So moving on to the last chapter and the last bit of content, and I know I'm covering a lot of ground for today, but I do want to hit on some of the important points here. Theory is about an abstract system of concepts with indications as to the relationship among those concepts to help us understand a phenomenon. So to break that down, right, theory generally has concepts or topics that indicate a relationship among those topics. That is, the different ideas within a theory have relationships to each other and help us to understand the world. For instance, right, the Big Bang Theory or the theory of the extinction of dinosaurs are 2 examples there, right? There's a lot of theories about how dinosaurs went extinct. For instance, maybe a meteor crashed into the earth. So a theory is suggesting or bringing truth to that situation. So theories can be used in a lot of different scenarios. Concepts are words or phrases related to a theory. If you think back to the example of the rhetorical situation that I gave earlier, exigence and constraints are 2 examples of terms that are used to create that theory. Concepts are the building blocks that create theory. These concepts can be nominal, things that you can't observe. That is, something like exigence. You don't necessarily observe that in a key way. Or real, observable phenomena. For instance, an audience might be observable. So, all that to say, communication and theory is not necessarily about this ivory tower. Theory helps us to explain and make sense of the world. Why are 2 people from 2 different cultures having difficulty understanding each other? Theory helps us to understand. For instance, space negotiation theory looks at how people from different cultures try to manage their reputation. Theory is predictive. Past is prologue. Theory can help us analyze and understand what might be about to happen. How do people manage or deal with a crisis in an organization? And theory can be used for things like social and political change to empower us to have the skills to investigate and look at challenging topics. Additionally, over the course of this term, we'll be looking at a lot of different approaches to theory. There's the positivistic and empirical approach that says that there's objective reality and uses a very scientific method to understand material. There's an interpretive method that's more about us making sense of and trying to understand the world in its own terms, interpreting the world, and critical, which focuses on social, political change, and similar types of issues, again, related to the study of power. And we'll be looking at theory that covers all three of those. One of my favorite shows, BoJack Horseman, there's a joke about what do they know? Do they know things, right? And that's an approach known as epistemology. Epistemology is the study of how do we know things and how do we make sense of the world. Ontology is about the study of identity and where identity comes from. Well, axiology is focused more specifically on the process of acquiring, using, and making knowledge. There's also covering law, rules, and system approaches, which are different ways that we can understand knowing as well. Covering law generally looks at things such as precedent and the ways that it shapes it. Rules are less formal, but they're instead about the norms that we might create. And a systems approach looks at the structure of organizations and the way that that motivates behavior too. We can do a lot of different tests of theory as well. As we go through the theories in this class, you'll notice that these theories are critiqued and discussed in your chapters on the basis of a lot of different factors. Its scope, is it too wide, too narrow? How much can this theory be used? Is it logically consistent? Does the theory make sense? Parsimony is how simple and clear the theory is. Is it really abstract in the tower, or does it make a lot of sense to people? Utility, can we use this theory in a lot of practical day-to-day settings? Testability, can we test or use this theory to determine if it's accurate? Purism is the idea that a theory is kind of like a snowball. Does it build or motivate future research? Is it used in other situations? And does it stand the test of time? Is the theory still relevant now compared to 50 years ago with the ways that communication has changed with the development of technology and so on? So that might be some of the ways that we can critically think about and evaluate theory. For this class, no theory is gospel. My goal in this course is not to convince or persuade you to adopt any views about theory or to adopt any social or political views. Instead, to give you a set of tools to work with and to examine theory on your own terms. If you find that there's a theory you disagree with, awesome. I encourage you to push back and to think about what it is about theory that doesn't necessarily work for you, because theories are constantly changing, evolving, and being modified over time. There have been a lot of bad theories. For instance, the racist and eugenicist theory of race science, the idea that somehow people are more or less intelligent on the basis of race, of course has been disproven and debunked. But that's an example of not all theories being good or correct or true. So I know we covered a lot of ground between the syllabus, course expectations, and the first three chapters. But just to recap, we talked a little bit about the course and the ways that it's set up based on weekly assignments and quizzes. We talked about theory, how it's a tool to help us to analyze and make sense of the world. And lastly, we now have a tool set to analyze and make sense of theory. This first week is mostly an introduction, but starting in week 2, we'll actually start to dive into the theories themselves. So we'll start to look at those theories and a few really core ones to the study of communication next week. So as a reminder, by the end of the day on Sunday, please complete the week 1 activity and the week 1 quiz along with the reading from this first week. Have a great first week and welcome back from spring break. I look forward to hearing from you all and learning a little bit more about you in the weeks ahead. Have a great one.